Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today, I would like to talk about Noam Chomsky and his book on anarchism. I will delve into the first chapter of the book because it is divided in 5 and all of them are very interesting, but I think the first one it put the key to understand the ideas of anarchism because Noam Chomsky ideologically he aligns with anarcho-syndicalism and libertarian socialism as he defines them, and he will explore them through his book. So for those of you who don't know who is Noam Chomsky, he's an American public intellectual, he's a linguist philosopher, a cognitive scientist, a historian, political theorist, a philosopher, social critic, and political activist. And this is one of the things that have defined his career because in 1967 he published The Responsibility of Intellectuals, which was an essay very interesting to read even today, in which his thesis was that the people who were considered as intellectual had a responsibility within the society. For him, the intellectuals, going back to the epistemologic meaning at the end of 19th century in France, are those people who have are lucky enough, as he says, to be able to survive only through exploring what is happening in the world. So people who materially are not rich enough, but still they have the capacity to do not have to stay like, let's say, 40 hours doing a different job apart from researching. So the intellectuals for Chomsky are those who can focus all their time to research, and henceforth is their responsibility to expose the lies that the superpowers are spreading towards society. He wrote responsibility of intellectuals in the context of the war in Vietnam, and he uses a lot of examples of that time in which the so-called intellectuals in the United States were clearly aligned with the support of the war in Vietnam. Noam Chomsky criticized widely that. It is interesting that he says so because he also points that in that time, in the 1960s, which coincide with the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., the students' revolt in the USA, also feminist movement, LGBT plus, with the Stonewall uprising in 1969, and all the movement that spread across the world in West Germany, East Germany, France, Mexico, Egypt, Spain, and Italy, basically dozens of countries around the world. And he said that at that time in the US, it was really a bad view by the general public to protest against the war in Vietnam. It was considered as something unpatriotic, that you were a traitor, a supporter of communism, and so on. And Chomsky explained how in that time, I think it was in Boston, who he referred to the state as the kind of more liberal in the whole country. Liberal meaning that was the most progressive of the whole region. They were thrown stones when they were protesting against the war, so they had to seek refuge inside a church. That was 1967, 68. Obviously, after 68, the paradigm started to shift a bit, and most people opposed the Vietnam War. It was after the Tet Offensive in Vietnam when the USA had to flee, but also with the image of the people in Vietnam burning under the napalm throw by the US soldiers. But it's interesting that he says that because at that time, also the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr. was seen as something evil which was going to destroy the society. So Chomsky is interesting because he makes a historical review about that everything that nowadays we consider as of common sense, but like 50 years ago it was not so. So he challenged us to say, okay, there are things now that they're being demonized by the general public. When he says general public, he points to how the media manipulate the population and manufacture consent, which is another concept of him that I will explore later. Well, it's not exactly from him because he gives the credit to another thinker, Walter Lippmann, but it's an idea that he always used. Manufacturing consent is when all the media they agree implicitly to put the same news all the time in order to make the mass of people believe the reality that is being told all the time, like kind of bombardment of news. So the thing is, going back to the intellectuals, he also refers to Socrates when he was forced to drink the hemlock because he was corrupting the minds of the people in the ancient Greek. Also, he points to the Dreyfus affair, which was at the end of the 19th century. There was a Jewish officer which in France was convicted for allegedly spying on the French and sending information, I think it was to Germany. This was a complete lie, but one which all the powers in France agree upon it, because the economy in the country was in a bad situation, so they needed a scapegoat, and there were people who defend fervently Alfred Dreyfus, for example, Rosa Luxemburgo, and most famously Émile Zola, which was a French writer and who wrote a text which was really powerful, using a lot of metaphors, criticizing the French state, and the title is called J'accuse, I accuse, and he point to accusing the state, the judicial powers, because Dreyfus was sentenced by in theory an impartial judge, but the judge was a complete lie. There were many proofs that were fabricated, and precisely Émile Zola was on that trial, and he points the ridiculous of the situation. So Chomsky, apart from being, as I mentioned before, a linguist philosopher, and in fact he's a major figure in analytic philosophy and one of the founders of the field of cognitive science, he is also called sometimes as the father of modern linguistics. He has been a revolutionary in that field. He has been almost all his life teaching at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the famous MIT, and also is the author of more than 150 books on many topics like linguistic, war, politics, and mass media, because Chomsky combines this political activism with his mastery in linguistics, in history, in political analysis, and so on. Among his books, I will say that the best that I have read are On Anarchism, one that is Who Governs the World, is a criticism and exposing of documents about the US invasion and instigation of coup d'etat in areas of Asia, Latin America, many parts of the world. There are also like many essays that he has written, like as I mentioned earlier, Responsibility of Intellectual, but all of them are great. He wrote 2 years ago one about the climate change. Last year it was published one with B.J. Presa, which is an amazing political theories about the attitude of the USA towards the countries in Asia during the Cold War, and many more texts that he has done. Also, it's incredible because he is always considering a lot of interviews. He's participating in every kind of political activism. I was looking before in Google, and 2 days ago he signed a letter to release a prisoner in India. 2 weeks ago he wrote a letter also. He signed a letter to release prisoners, activists, ecological prisoners from the UK that has been jailed for protesting in a non-violent manner against the United Kingdom government for not doing enough to stop the climate change. So he's always involved in the public sphere. If you look about what he has been doing in the last week, you will always see like an interview that was released like 2 weeks ago. But he also consists interview with kind of small media, also with personal podcast, which I think this is impressive considering the amount of work that he has, and also the fact that he's 94 years old. For instance, I was listening yesterday to a podcast with one person which was amazed, and he told the story of how when he was in Canada at the university, they were trying to create a more egalitarian system at the university, and they faced the backlash for the right-wing kind of adversaries. And this person wrote to Noam Chomsky, and he was surprised and told to Chomsky during the podcast that Chomsky actually replied to him. And Chomsky said, well, I really believe that the things, the deeds that we need to do in order to change society come from the bottom up, not from the not from up to the bottom. And it is very important that Chomsky said that, because after that he said something like, as my dear and loved friend who died, Howard Zinn, who is a great historian, said, the big changes on society across history are from the masses of people. Howard Zinn is this historian who was specialized in public history and the people's history of the world. He wrote the people's history of America, and basically people's history means that teaching about the history, but through the documents, the testimonies of, let's say, the mass of people. So if you are writing about the Second World War in Britain, instead of talking about Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, Vivan, and all the political members of parliament, you can talk about how the common people survive the bombardment of Nazi Germany, let's say in Hackney, London, how some had to flee to the north, and you can study their diaries and so on. Personally, this is my favorite field of history. There are incredible books such as People's History of the World, of Chris Harman, the already mentioned The People's History of America by Howard Zinn, which was also very involved in the public sphere, criticizing the war in Vietnam and many other conflicts that were happening at his time. So it doesn't surprise me that Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky were very friends, because same with Angela Davis, the political theorist teacher who was very involved in the 1960s in the Black Panthers, in the Communist Party, and so on, or Herbert Marcuse, which I have talked about him in one of the episodes. Those people, apart from being intellectuals, have been all their life involved in activism, and we should appreciate the deeds for this kind of people, because they have a voice to speak to a huge amount of people of the world. And for example, Noam Chomsky has done even many interviews last year with the Spanish programs, Spanish newspaper and podcasts, such as he spoke, I think, with Público. He spoke also with La Base, the podcast of Pablo Iglesias, and he's always trying to get involved in what is happening. His analysis of the reality in every country, not just in the war in Ukraine, which is the most commonly topic talk nowadays, but also about the attitude of America, of the US in Asia and other areas of the world. And he's very humble, because he always says that, okay, everything is in the documents. I am lucky because I have time to read all of them, go through of them. Many people have to toil, working in many different jobs, tiring jobs, and they do not have the time, neither the energy to go home later on and explore this information. So myself and the other intellectuals, we have a responsibility towards them. Intellectuals, as I mentioned earlier, is not a kind of narcissist approach, but rather an epistemological concept of the people who can dedicate their life to study. So this episode has, I wanted to speak briefly about Noam Chomsky, but it's taking a bit longer, so I will stop here, and in the next one I will start directly with On Anarchism, which is in my opinion, is one of the best books of Noam Chomsky, and surely about the anarchist political theory and philosophy is really complete, because it gives a lot of testimonies, different historians, activists, and so on. I will talk about that in the next episode.